What we're going to be doing in most of the rest of the book is writing code. So what I want to start doing in this lesson is start creating the to-do list application. And as I mentioned right away, I'm going to start thinking about it like this. So let's just go ahead and start writing that code. Let me copy that, move that over here. So what I have over here, as you can see, I created two files, database.scala and ToDoList.scala, and I have those over here in the editor. And what I want to do in the to-do list file right here is to start creating this main method or main function, and I'm calling it to-do list. And what I note over here in the book is that having done this type of thing before, one of the first things I know that I'm going to want to do is create a line like this where I create an instance of the database. So as this shows, I know that I want a database class, and I also want it to take in the file name right here as a parameter, and that's going to be where I store the data. So then we come over here and we start creating the database class, and it's going to take in, we could call that like database file or file name. What do I call that in the book? I call it file name. So to be consistent with the book, I will do that. And that is the entire database class for right now. And I am going to put an end on this one down here because this area here is going to get full of methods that we're going to create. So I'll put that there. And then we can just say methods are TBD right inside of there. So what I want to do inside this class is I want to create methods that will mimic the way SQL functions typically work. So I'm going to want to have an insert method, a delete method, and then maybe a select all method since we're trying to do some simple things here. So in a few moments, I'll start creating these methods. Before I do that, I want to reiterate that my rule about using try here is that anytime you reach into the outside world, you're going to want to use something like try or either. And I'm going to start off using try. I do note here that this is overkill for a flat file database, but it helps if you really think about this being real database code where you're accessing a database on another server or a cluster, because the API actually is not going to be that much different. If you were to access the database like that, you would actually use functions that are going to return a value like try. And that's what I want to show in this database class as we go through developing it. So again, as a robust code must return one of these types. And the way it's going to affect our code over here is like that. So I can keep that visible while I do this. So what we're going to do over here is start developing these functions. And by that, I mean in the next several lessons, we're going to start creating these. So when you think about insert, what's going to happen is you're going to take something like a record, which is going to be a string. You're going to insert that into the database. And then an interesting part of this discussion is what should an insert method return? Now, an actual SQL insert, I think, might return the number of rows inserted. But actually, the way I'm going to think about this is writing to a file. And when I write to a file, there really is no return type. You write to the file and it either works or it fails. And when you don't have a return type, you normally return unit. But since we need to handle errors, what we do is we wrap that unit inside of try, and then we'll say that that code is to be determined. Select all is going to do what its name implies. So it's going to select all rows from the database. And this one's interesting because this parameter here will be empty. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But now when you think about what you're trying to get from the database, what you're going to do if we select all, you're going to retrieve every row in that database file. So this is going to return, as it shows in here, you're going to return a sequence of string from this. And the only difference is when we account for errors, we're going to wrap that sequence in a try right here like that. So that's the return type for select all. And then the delete function is going to delete by index. So we'll stay with the code that's in the book and say we're going to use the index to delete is going to be an int value. And this one, I am showing an int here. So let's see what I was thinking here. Delete returns try of int, and its int value indicates the number of rows that were deleted. So that's an interesting one. So on insert over here, I did not return an int, and that was because we can just return unit, and then the success and failure values are going to tell us whether it worked or not. Over here, what I was thinking with delete is if you get an int value, an index value that's not accurate. Let's say you have 3 rows in the database and then this index is 99 that's passed in for some reason, then this int right here is going to be 0. But of course, if you have 3 rows and then you say, well, delete the first row, then this will have 1. So that's what I was thinking there. That's what I had in mind there. So that's the way we're going to implement delete when we get to it. And one thing I want to do is come back to this one right here. So earlier in this course, I told you that when you see a function like this that takes no input parameters, that should scream out to you that this function is impure. And I also told you in another lesson that there is one exception to that rule, and that's when you have a situation like this where, oops, I did that wrong. That needs to be a val there. Let's correct that. But this is the one situation where this is not true. So what's going to happen inside of this code is inside of here, this is going to actually use that DB file name. So you can think of DB file name as being passed in right here as a string. The only difference is we're not getting it from there, we're getting it here from the class level. So what I mean by that is if this had somehow been a standalone function right here, then we would have DB file name as a string. And then I could say, okay, this now looks like a pure function because I am taking an input parameter here and I do have a return value here. The only difference here is that we're now merging the object-oriented programming and functional programming styles. So I'm creating a class in the object-oriented sense, and that class is taking this input parameter in as a val. And then what I'm going to do inside of this method or function is use that DB file name. So in this particular case, you could think of DB file name as coming in this door rather than coming in some side door. And I know I spent some time on that in a previous lesson, so I just wanted to reiterate that here. So let's go ahead and get rid of that and go back to that code just like that and save that. And I have some errors because I need to import Scala.util.dat, try, success, and failure. And save that. So far so good. Those are methods we're going to implement. And I do note here in the book that as a final note, my personal standard is that when I define a function inside of a class, I'm going to refer to it as a method. I'm sure I'll slip up here and there, but in general, when I define functions like this inside of a class, I'll refer to these as methods here, here, and here. And anywhere else I define them, I'll refer to them as functions. And I note here this is not a standard Scala naming convention. It's just my own personal convention. But it feels weird when you're talking about functional programming and then you constantly use the term method. So that's how I came up with this standard. So to finish off this lesson, we have this code right here. And over here in the to-do list application, I am creating an instance of that database class right there, and I call that variable DB. And we'll be using that more down here. And I also just started the compiler down here, so this is watching the code that I'll be developing as we go along in the videos that follow this one.